Our next speaker, renowned researcher, investigator, and author Kathleen Marden is a New Hampshire native who now makes her home in Florida. She earned her BA degree in social sciences from the University of New Hampshire, where she also did graduate work in education. Kathleen has lectured nationally and internationally and is a frequent guest on radio shows all around the country. Her expert testimony has been heard on the History Channel, Discovery, National Geographic, Destination America, and most recently on Ancient Aliens. She is MUFON's National Director of Experiencer Research and on the Board of Directors of the Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Encounters, also known by the acronym FREE. Many people know Kathy as the niece of Betty and Barney Hill, whose close encounter and UFO abduction in 1961 stirred worldwide interest in the subject. She investigated the Hills' controversial case, leaving no stone unturned, and in an effort to separate fact from fiction. Her focused dedication to this seminally important case led to the publication of 3 books, all co-authored by nuclear physicist and scientific ufologist Stanton T. Friedman. The books are, and are available in our reading room from Kathleen, Captured: The Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, Science Was Wrong, and Fact and Fiction and Flying Saucers. Marden is also co-author of the terrific book, The Alien Abduction Files, with friend and colleague Denise Stoner. She is one of 3 authors of FREE's new book, Beyond UFOs, The Science of Contact and Non-Human Intelligence. She completed a MUFON-sponsored 3-year comprehensive study on experiencers with the distinguished Dr. Don C. Dondieri, an academic psychologist and statistician. And her next and 5th book will be released in 2019. Again, autographed copies are available in the store, and her website is kathleen-marden.com. The subject of her presentation today is the Betty and Barney Hill UFO story and its far-reaching impact. Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only Kathleen Marden.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back here in Exeter again. And last year when I was speaking, some people said to me, "Why don't you talk about Betty and Barney?" And I realized it had been years since I had done a lecture in New Hampshire on Betty and Barney Hill, my aunt and uncle. So I asked for a show of hands, and the majority of people said that they wanted to hear me speak about Betty and Barney and my research. So that is what I'm going to be talking about today. And I even have some brand new evidence that Stanton Friedman recently discovered in one of his file cabinets when he was cleaning out his files. So I'm very excited about this. Here we see Betty and Barney and their dog Delcy, who was with them on that fateful trip to Niagara Falls and up to Toronto and Montreal in September of 1961. The center photo is, let's see if I can use the pointer here. Oh well. The center photo is a painting done by David Baker. And David was a New Hampshire artist, now deceased, that was based upon Barney's description of what he saw. And Barney was under hypnosis when he described that. And on the right-hand side is the book that I wrote about their case. I had researched and investigated their case for many, many years, still continue to do so. I've driven the entire route that they took that night with my husband, and stopping at the places that they stopped. I tried and tried to have missing time. I tried and tried to have hallucinations like the debunkers and the disinformants say happened to Betty and Barney. And that didn't happen to my husband and myself, even though we were 20 years older than they were at the time of their experience. So let's begin. So these are some photographs of me with my Aunt Betty. Well, the top left is me when I was a baby. I was born in Portsmouth, and my parents lived right next door to Betty and her first husband. And the center, because I'm about 5 years old, I guess. And then on the top right, I went to Niagara Falls with my aunt and uncle, not Betty and Barney, another aunt and uncle, about a month before Betty and Barney went to Niagara Falls. I was showing the family the photographs that I'd taken there and talking about what a wonderful time we had. And Betty said to Barney that she had never been there. So he decided to surprise her with a trip to Niagara Falls. And that's how all of this started. And then the lower left is my high school graduation photograph from Sanborn Seminary in Kingston. And Look magazine was there. Their story had been released as the result of a violation of confidentiality, and they had cooperated with John G. Fuller to write The Interrupted Journey. And Paul Fusco, who was a photographer for Look magazine, came to my high school graduation to take photographs of the graduation and of the party after to show what a normal family we really are. And the bottom right photograph is Betty and myself at Yokin's, and that was after she had been diagnosed with lung cancer. So that was in the fall of 2003 when that photograph was taken. She passed away in October of 2004. Here we have my mother and myself. My mother's name was Janet Miller. She's also deceased. And Betty. And that's my house that I lived in as an adult in East Kingston, New Hampshire. On the night of September 20th, 1961, Betty had called my mother. It was actually the afternoon. And I was home from school, and my mother was talking to Betty, and then my mother came to me after and told me about a UFO sighting that she had had back in 1958 in South Kingston, New Hampshire. She went grocery shopping every Friday night. And one of those nights when she was grocery shopping, she saw this, what I think of as a mothership, hovering over a field. And there were smaller craft that were flying around it and then flew into it. It was a multiple witness sighting because my mother stopped the car and ran to a nearby home, and the people who lived in that home went outside and saw that craft as well. Funny thing happened to my mother on one of those Friday night grocery shopping trips. I must have been about 12, 13, 14 years old. I know I was a teenager, and she did not come home after that grocery shopping trip. She was very, very late, and my father was very concerned about her. She had bought frozen food, and by the time she arrived home, the frozen food had melted. The ice cream was soup, and she had no explanation for what had happened. She had this missing time. And so I believe that my mother was an experiencer as well. It tends to be generational. Well, this is the route that Betty and Barney traveled through New Hampshire, upstate New Hampshire, all the way to their home in Portsmouth. And you can see the mileage from each place. From Montreal to the place where they sighted that UFO, in New Hampshire, and you can see the stars where they stopped. They sighted the UFO 4 miles south of Lancaster, looked like a new star in the sky that kept growing larger and larger. It was only 169 miles to their home from there. So it was about 11:15, and Betty's watching this craft come in closer and closer while Barney is driving, and she wants him to stop the car so she can get a better look at it. He does stop the car. They get out at the Mount Cleveland picnic area, and they look at the craft there. Many of you know the story, so I'm not going into a lot of detail because there's new information I want to cover today. It was about 11:30 when they went by Cannon Mountain. If you go to the Hugh Gallen Bridge up in the White Mountains today, then you will see the view that Betty and Barney saw when they entered Franconia Notch in 1961. It was Route 3 then. And Betty looked up and she saw this craft over the building on top of Cannon Mountain. And when the craft passed over the lighted building, the light went out. And she was very curious about this, but we know today that there are electromagnetic disturbances that cause lights to go out, that cause cameras to shut down when craft are nearby. Very shortly after that, they stopped at the Old Man of the Mountain, and I kind of like that little UFO. They determined that the craft was around 70 to 80 feet in diameter, based upon the length of the old man's profile. It was spinning, and they believed that it was lighted on only one side because it had a twinkling effect as it turned around. Well, the craft was following them, right beside them, sometimes ahead of them, as they were driving down Route 3. They left Franconia Notch. They came into North Lincoln, to the area where the cabins were in that time frame, where the Indian Head Resort is. And Betty wanted to get a better look at this craft because it was coming in closer and closer. So she said, "Barney, stop again." And he was looking for a place to pull over, but before he could, this craft surged ahead and stopped right over the highway. And then it descended in their direction to about 200 feet above their vehicle. Barney had to stop the car right in the middle of the road. And he got out of the car. He had binoculars with him. He had a pistol in his pocket that he had taken out at the Mount Cleveland picnic area because he was afraid that there would be bears coming out of the woods. And so he got out. He's resting his arms on their 1957 Chevy Bel Air, looking up at this craft, which he described as looking like a giant pancake, lighted on the side that he could see. Very bright lights shining through the windows. Betty remained in the passenger seat. Barney kept the car door open. The craft then shifted location to an adjacent field, and when it did, Barney followed it into that field. He continued to have his binoculars with him. He stood there looking up because the internal lights were on in the car, so Betty could not see what was going on in the field. And as Barney looked at that craft, it descended 100 feet above him and then about 50 feet and about 100 feet away. He could see figures looking back at him, and all of a sudden, all but one of them turned in unison and went to what appeared to be a panel on the back of the corridor that seemed to encircle this craft. The one standing in the window frightened him terribly, especially because little red lights started to come out from the sides of that craft on what he called little bat-like wings, and something started to drop out of the bottom of that craft. He was afraid that he was going to be captured like a bug in a net. He became terrified, and he ran back to the car screaming to Betty, that they had to get out of there or they were going to be captured. He threw the binoculars onto the seat. Betty had become very, very distressed because he had been in that field much longer than she thought he should be. She was ready to get out of the car and find him even though the car was in the middle of the road. So he got into the car. As he was getting in, he saw the craft change location again. It was now above their car. He started speeding down Route 3. He said to Betty, "Roll down the window. I think it's above us. Roll down the window and look up." She rolled down the window. She looked up. She was expecting to see lights. She didn't see lights. The moon was 3/4 full that night. It was a bright light night, but all she saw was darkness. They later realized it was the craft. The next thing they knew, they heard a series of buzzing sounds striking the trunk of their vehicle. It caused the car to vibrate and a tingling sensation to pass through their bodies, this electrical tingling sensation. The next thing they knew, they were 35 miles down the highway with very little recall. Is Barney standing in the field? That's his sketch. He sketched that when he arrived home on September 20th, 1961. My son did that sketch of the craft. They heard these two sets of buzzing sounds. When they were 35 miles down the highway, they heard their second set. And Barney was still trying to write this off as something else. He did not believe that flying saucers were real. He was a confirmed skeptic. And at that time, Betty said, "Barney, now do you believe in flying saucers?" And he said, "Don't be ridiculous, Betty. There's no such thing." He said, "I'll show you that that's not a flying saucer." And he stopped the car, and he drove it from one side of the road to the other, trying to make that buzzing sound, and he could not do it. They drove on home. They did have memories of a couple of things. They remembered observing a fiery orb sitting on the ground. At first, they thought that it was the moon setting, but it was not. The scientists discovered that it couldn't have been. They remembered encountering a roadblock somewhere along the way. They didn't know where or when it occurred. They drove on to Portsmouth looking for a police officer, looking for someone that they could report this to. But when they arrived in Portsmouth, they hadn't found anyone. And this is just the route that they followed. You can see, and I wish that this pointer would work. There it is. Right up here is the section of New Hampshire where this occurred. Here's Twin Mountain, where the picnic area was, just south of there, Franconia Notch, Cannon Mountain, and it follows down. And this is the area where they believe they were abducted in Thornton, New Hampshire. The only problem is that they remembered finding themselves on a strange road that they hadn't been on before, and they had no idea how they had gotten there. And there's a bridge right here that crosses Route 3. I was with them when they finally found the abduction site. So off from Route 3, they would drive onto 175 and down here, and this was Millbrook Road. It's a housing development now, but in those days it was just a dirt road, a logging road. And so that is basically the route that they took. When they arrived home, it was later than they anticipated. They felt very, very dirty, unusually dirty for having been on a day trip, having taken showers before that, and they couldn't explain that. They were very upset, though, because that craft came so close to them They were afraid that they might have been exposed to radiation. Betty called my mother, and my mother called a neighbor of ours who was a physicist, and he said, for some unknown reason, if you have a compass, take the compass out to the car and see how the needle reacts. Well, we know when you put it up under the hood of the car by the battery, the needle is going to spin. And on the old metal surface of a car that old, it will fluctuate some. But Betty took this compass out to the car. She started on the side of the car. Didn't move, just slight fluctuation. But then she found spots, very shiny spots, on the trunk of the car that hadn't been there the day before. They were in the area where that craft had emitted those buzzing sounds that were striking the trunk of the car. And when she put the compass over those spots, the needle would spin and spin. And when she moved it away, they would drop down. You can see her dress up at the top. Many questions about that. It had been in fine shape when she put it on in the morning. When she arrived home, the hem was torn down on one side. The dress was torn from waist to hemline. The zipper up at the top was torn. The thick zipper fabric was even torn. She had no explanation for how that could have occurred. The watches they were wearing that they had checked at 10 o'clock that night had stopped working and never ran again. And the tops of Barney's best dress shoes were so deeply scraped that he had to buy new shoes. He was a meticulous dresser. He wore his shoes for yard work after that. These are not his shoes. I used my husband's just to show you what his shoes would have looked like. So that's a facsimile. This is their house in Portsmouth on State Street. My mother had a visitor, my father's best friend, who stopped by our house for coffee every night on his way home from work. And he had been the chief of police in Newton, New Hampshire. And he said, we've received directions from Pease Air Force Base that if anyone has a UFO sighting, Pease wants them to report it. So, being dutiful citizens, Betty and Barney made a report to Pease Air Force Base. Here's their Project Blue Book report. There's one page of it you can see. Here's some of what they said that I think is important. When it seemed to be a matter of hundreds of feet above their vehicle, it would be the size of a dinner plate at arm's length. Really huge. It stopped and hovered in the air. While hovering, objects began to appear from the body. Those are those little red lights. The flight was described as jerky, not smooth. Well, I found contradictions in the Air Force files. In the Blue Book report that Betty and Barney made, which is in the original Blue Book report, it stated that the vehicle ascended and descended rapidly and that it swooped down. In Blue Book's assessment that was revised, it said there was no lateral or vertical movement noted, contradictory to what Betty and Barney actually reported. They said there was no evidence presented to indicate the object was due to other than natural causes. How could that be? And they said it was probably an advertising searchlight or the planet Jupiter as the result of a strong temperature inversion. Well, I knew that temperature inversions were used as kind of a blanket explanation for UFOs back in that time frame. So I contacted a senior meteorologist and I asked him to look into the National Weather Service archives. And he did, and he also consulted with 2 other meteorologists, and this is what he wrote back to me. He said the light east airflow that night would have caused subsidence warming, just the opposite of an inversion as claimed by the Air Force. So we see there's a cover-up, And if you purchase my book with Stanton Friedman, Fact, Fiction, and Flying Saucers, it's all about the history of the cover-up, the Air Force's investigation of UFOs, their findings, their major studies, and their decision to cover up their findings. Why? And the people who worked in conjunction with the Air Force to spread disinformation, basically, about every major evidence case in history. So, what I found during my investigation was a report written by 2 Air Force officers from Maxwell Air Force Base. The title of their report was, "Should the U.S. Air Force Open Project Blue Book?" And one of the cases that they included in that report was the case of Betty and Barney Hill. Here are some of their statements, quoted. "The Air Force's official explanation turned out to be almost as erratic as the radar and visual sightings themselves. Blue Book's inversion explanation could not be supported. The official Air Force release concludes by stating that no evidence was presented to indicate that the object was due to other than natural causes, but makes no mention of the radar tracking. The radar shimmering originally reported to the press was much more than a shimmer indicating an air mass. It was a bona fide sighting. It is not clear why Project Blue Book purposely withheld information to the press regarding Pease Air Force Base radar sighting." It wasn't only Pease. Earlier that night, the North Concord, Vermont weather station also had a radar sighting of a UFO. More quotes. Project Blue Book ended their investigation of the Betty and Barney Hill sighting and the corresponding radar sightings without ever recontacting the Hills. This is a particularly disturbing aspect of this sighting. They sent the Hills file containing 2 articles from Look magazine, this is after it was made public, written by John Fuller, and articles from the Boston Traveler written by John Luttrell to the Pentagon. So obviously, they did have interest in that case. Well, when Betty arrived home, she had never read anything on UFO. She'd never read a book on that topic. So she went to the Portsmouth Public Library and took this book out, written by Donald Kehoe, who was the head of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. There was an address inside that book, because no one had been abducted prior to that date that anyone knows of. And so there was no information that could have led Betty to believe that something else happened to them. She wrote a letter to Donald Kehoe, and I'm going to quote part of that letter. She wrote, "As it glided closer, he was able to see inside this object, but not too closely. He did see many figures scurrying about as though they were making some hurried type of preparation. One figure was observing us from the windows. From the distance this was seen, the figures appeared to be about the size of a pencil and seemed to be dressed in some kind of shiny black uniform. At this point, my husband became shocked and got back in the car in a hysterical condition, laughing and repeating that they were going to capture us. He started driving the car. The motor had been left running. As we started to move, we heard several buzzing or beeping sounds that seemed to be striking the trunk of the car." So the question is, how could the Air Force conclude that this was the planet Jupiter? The NICAP investigator was Walter Webb. He was an astronomer who worked at the Hayden Planetarium. In October, he went up to Betty's and Barney's house, and he interviewed them separately and then together for a period of 8 hours. And he wrote in his report, written about a week after he did the interview, "The approaching UFO finally filled up the entire field of the binoculars. The leader at the window held a special attraction for the witness and frightened him terribly. The witness said he could almost feel this figure's intense concentration to do something, to carry out a plan. Mr. Hill believed that he was going to be captured like, quote, a bug in a net, close quote. That is when he knew it was no conventional aircraft he was observing, but something alien and unearthly, containing beings of a superior type, beings that were not human. So you can see all of the evidence that Barney actually saw non-humans on that craft, that it hovered just above their vehicle. It's all there in the original files. But the disinformants said that Betty and Barney saw only a distant light in the sky, and that after Betty had dreams about this, they decided they had been abducted and they had a close encounter. This was written first. Well, they went on wanting to learn more and more about what had happened to them, and Barney developed post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of his close observation of these non-humans on this craft looking down at him, and that feeling he had that he was going to be captured, and that missing time, and all of that physical evidence. It bothered him greatly, especially being a black man who was raised in Virginia during a period when there was segregation in this country. He ended up being referred finally to Dr. Benjamin Simon for treatment. Ben Simon was a renowned psychiatrist. He had an office down in Boston, and Betty and Barney drove to Boston every Saturday for a period of about 6 months. He saw Barney first, and he did hypnoanalysis with Barney. He asked Barney every place along the way during that hypnosis if anything that he was thinking of reminded him of something that happened earlier in his life. It was pretty straightforward hypnotherapy with Betty. They were hypnotized separately, and what came under hypnosis is everything I told you already. I'm not going to cover that again. But they also remembered finding themselves in a new area. There were tall trees all around. They saw a red light. They saw a roadblock. They were wondering first if there was a car if there was an accident. And then Barney said to Betty, "Are we being robbed?" And then Barney said to Betty, "It's them. It's the ones I saw in the craft when I was standing in the field." Betty became terrified because these non-humans started to walk toward them. They broke into 2 groups. 3 went to Barney's door. Barney opened his door and put his foot on the ground. He was willing to be cooperative because he thought that if he grabbed for that gun or if he fought, they would harm him. Betty had a different thought. She decided that she was going to open the door and escape into the woods. It didn't happen. They came to the door. They pointed something at her. She lost consciousness for a little while. And then she woke up as they were being taken down a path in the woods to a landed craft. Barney remembered only that his arms were outstretched, that he felt as if he were being supported, but he also felt as if he were floating, and only the toes of his shoes were bumping along the rocks on that path. And that's how his shoes were so deeply scraped. Well, they took Barney onto the craft first. He was not fighting. He was being very compliant. But Betty fought for her life. She didn't know if she would ever see her family again. She knew nothing about what they were doing. I imagine what ran through her mind is she going to be carried off to some distant planet? Will she be a specimen in an alien zoo? Who knew what would happen? And so she fought for her life, and she gave one who was escorting her on one side a good, swift kick. And that's how the hem on her dress was torn down, and the lining was torn from waist to hemline. They took control of her again, and they took her into a room. Betty and Barney were in separate examining rooms. It was very dimly lit in the hallway. In the examining rooms, the light was kind of a bluish light. There were no light fixtures. It just radiated from the walls. Is Betty being taken in? And they were given physical examinations. Betty's was first, and they were very interested in Betty's and Barney's skeletal structures. They examined their hands. They took their shoes off and examined their feet. They examined their joints. They moved their arms. They moved their legs. They were very interested in Betty's and Barney's nervous systems as well. And then they placed Betty on a table, and produced a long needle. And she said, "What are you going to do with that?" And telepathically, he said to her, "It's only a simple test, simple pregnancy test." She said, "It'll hurt." And he said, "It won't hurt." And he plunged the needle into her navel. And this was before we were using amniocentesis. And it hurt her so badly that Dr. Simon had to end that session early due to the wailing that she was doing under hypnosis. But as soon as she began to feel the pain, the leader, who stood up by her head, did something, and all of the pain went away. I've done hypnotherapy on many experiencers over the past many years. I no longer do it, I'm retired. But over and over again, that one that she called the leader was what we now call the escort. He follows that person around time and time again. He's the one who is the translator, who's the communicator, and the one who takes the pain away if the experiencer feels pain. Well, when the examiner went in to examine Barney, Betty was able to get up off the table, and she was left with the leader. And she had lost her fear of him, and she said to him, "I know you're not from around here. Where's your home port?" And so he produced this three-dimensional map. We don't know if it was a holographic image or if it was some kind of computer that would roll up. We know that other experiencers are seeing computers that roll up on craft. And so he produced this map. And he said to Betty, "Do you know where you are on this map?" And she said, "No, I don't know much about the universe." And he said, "Well, if you don't know where you are, how can I tell you where I'm from?" So you can see the star map that Betty sketched as the result of a post-hypnotic suggestion by Dr. Simon. And then Barney was taken first down through the path to the car, while Betty stayed behind arguing. She wanted evidence. She had found what she called a book, but it was more like a tablet, what we think of today as a tablet. And she saw alien symbols on that, and she wanted to take it with her. And the leader told her she could, but when she was leaving the craft, the crew would not let her have it. They took it away from her. And the leader apologized to her. And he also said, "We're really sorry that we frightened you in the beginning. We frightened you terribly." And Betty said, "Well, that's okay. I overcame my fear. And would you be able to come back? I know of people who have a lot more knowledge than I have." She was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. And she said, "We can set up a meeting so that you can discuss your information with them." And he said, "Well, that's not my decision to make. I don't know if I come back. Maybe I will." And Betty said, "Well, how will you find me if you come back?" And he said, "We can always find those that we want to find." Maybe they had given her an implant. So let's move on to after their therapy. They became very actively involved in the civil rights movement and in politics. And I was, as well, as a high school student. We attended Lyndon Johnson's inauguration. The invitation is right over here. Here are Barney and Betty, and here I am right there in the back. And Barney not only was very active with the NAACP, but in 1965, he was appointed to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission's State Advisory Committee. And this is the letter of invitation notifying him that he had been appointed. And he was also on the board of directors for the Rockingham County Community Action Program. Betty and Barney were on that committee, and he was the first chairman of the board of directors for that. He was on the executive board, and this is an award. It talks about an award he received from Sergeant Shriver for the good work that he did with the federal poverty program. Now, the debunkers say that Barney was a timid man, that Barney didn't have a mind of his own, that Barney would believe or do anything that Betty told him to. Well, I have this quote here because I think it's important. Valerie Cunningham is a black historian in Portsmouth. She knew Betty and Barney, and her parents also knew them in that time frame, and she stated, quote, "Barney was fearless and outspoken." In 1965, over Labor Day weekend, we were camping up in the White Mountains, still looking for that landing spot. And finally, we found it. And so this is an aerial view. This is Route 175, and they came down here apparently. Their car was turned around facing this direction, so I wonder if it was picked up at some point and turned around. And this, let's see, right here is where there were men in the road, and they were taken back in here where the craft landed. Here's Betty standing on that spot. No vegetation would grow on that spot after that. Here she is, holding the soil. She knew that it was in a sandy area. It felt like the lake sand to her. And so all of this was supposed to remain confidential. They had reputations to protect. They were an interracially married couple. She worked for the state in child welfare and adoption. He worked at the U.S. Post Office, and then he had all of these important positions in the poverty program, for the NAACP, for the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. They did not want anyone to know that they had this experience, or they would be perceived as a couple of crackpots. Well, they were willing to talk to UFO investigators, to scientists, to the family, to their close friends, even to a church group at the Unitarian Church in Portsmouth that they attended. And there was a violation of confidentiality in 1965. John Luttrell, who was the newspaper reporter for the Boston Traveler, wrote a letter to Betty and Barney in August of 1965, and he said he named the woman that he had been talking to, who knew all of the details of Betty's case. And in his letter, where he asked to meet with them, he said, quote, "Rest assured, my motives lie only in the realm of information. I have no intention of commercializing upon what's happened to the Hills." And Betty and Barney said, "No, we don't want this made public. We could lose our jobs." They went on a couple of months and were fine. But then this happened. Their story was told in the Boston Traveler. It ran for 5 days in a row. The cat was out of the bag. They were surrounded by media. They escaped from their house in Portsmouth to my grandparents' house in Kingston, New Hampshire. I grew up across the street from them. And we met as a family and decided what to do next. This had not a good impact on the family. It was not good at all. In fact, I had an aunt and uncle who lived in Kingston who ended up moving to Florida because of this. One good thing came out of it, as far as I'm concerned, and this is a new piece of information that I have not revealed previously. It's a letter that Stanton Friedman recently found in his files. It was written on July 7, 1976, by John Luttrell in return to questions that Stanton had asked. And he wrote, "In conclusion, Mr. Friedman, I can recall interviewing between 12 and 14 different people from different communities surrounding Franconia Notch, New Hampshire, none of whom knew one another, but all of whom remembered experiencing the same sighting at the same time the Hills did, in the same location. This was basically established by drawing comparable lines of sightings on an area map, and all intersected at precisely the same location reported by Mr. and Mrs. Hill." So here, finally, I've been looking for witnesses for years, and finally we have evidence of 12 to 14 witnesses to that UFO that night. I've also found a couple of men who were in the service in Maine who believed that they saw that craft traveling in that direction on that night as well. So, once that happened, Betty and Barney spoke for the first time publicly. They didn't talk about the abduction. They only talked about the sighting and the close encounter that took place at the Unitarian Church in Dover, New Hampshire in November of 1965. And John G. Fuller was there. He was a well-known author, highly respected, and he asked if he could write their story. And in the end, he did, along with Dr. Benjamin Simon and Betty and Barney. So The Interrupted Journey was the first book ever written. It doesn't include the scientific analysis. So the book that I have is updated. It has a lot of information that was not in the first book because we didn't know at that point. And it also appeared, their story appeared in 2 issues of Look magazine in the fall of 1966. And then in 1975, the UFO incident starring James Earl Jones and Estelle Parsons appeared on television. It was the movie of the week, and that is when the government really became upset. Philip Klass, a well-known debunker who was the go-to guy for the mainstream media after Dr. Edward Condon recommended him, ended up going to visit Dr. Simon. And he threatened Dr. Simon. He said, "Do you want to go down in history as the psychiatrist who hypnotized these 2 alien abductees? Or do you want to be known for all of the good work that you did?" He was the president of many societies. He was renowned in his field for what he did. And for the first time, he spoke out on radio saying that although he believed that Betty and Barney were telling the truth, it was the truth as they perceived it, and the tale had not, we did not have the scientific information to verify that this happened, and he felt that he could not come forward at that time and state that it was real. He thought that it might be something else, that maybe those 5 dreams that Betty had that had some information about what happened to them served as the foundation for all of this. This was the reason for my comparative analysis of what actually did happen to them, what they said separately under hypnosis, and I found evidence that it was a real event. There might have been a little bleed through from Betty's dreams as well, But over and over again, Betty and Barney stated the same thing, and it was not in Betty's dreams. So that is all encaptured. Well, there's has been a scientific evaluation of the evidence as well. The star map, the dress. Betty had placed the dress in her closet, and a pink powdery substance grew on the dress. And then the symbols that Betty saw on that craft. Here is Marjorie Fish, who was a brilliant woman from Ohio, an amateur astronomer, a teacher at that time, but she then ended up going to work at the Oak Ridge National Facility as a researcher there, and she read the books. You can see Stanton Friedman too, but she read the first book. She saw Betty's star map, and she reasoned that if this was a real place in our galaxy, she'd be able to find it. So she started constructing models. What she had to do was to go to Ohio State University. She had to sit in the astronomy department and copy the distance data out of their catalogs. And then she would take that distance data and all of the information about the stars and take it home. She would have to do the math to know where to place every one of these beads on monofilament line, beads of different sizes and colors, representing different stars, and in a three-dimensional frame, because we didn't have computers back then. So she did this, and she could not find a match. Some of the reports state that she made 13 models, others state 23. I do not know if it was 13 or 23. Haven't been able to find out for certain. But she did many models, never able to find the place that these non-human entities came from. And finally, a new catalog was released with different distance data and stars that we didn't know about back then. And Marjorie was able to find a very close match. So what you see here on the purple lines were the lines that Betty drew. There was a turquoise line that she erased when she was doing this map. She put it out here instead of here and then changed it. And those red, which look kind of pink, are Marjorie's lines. So you can see that Betty's map was fairly close, approximating the real map of what happened. So here is Marjorie's identification. You can see here Zeta Reticuli 1 and Zeta Reticuli 2. These are the star systems that she believed these non-human entities came from. Here's our sun right up here. And she found some very interesting information that caused many scientists to believe that this was a real event. First of all, she stated that all the pattern stars that were sun-like were on Betty's map, although only 5% of the sun-like stars in our local galactic neighborhood out 54 years, only 5% are sun-like. She also said all the sun-like stars in the volume of space on the map are in that pattern. So this was quite extraordinary. The statisticians said that it was anywhere between 1,000 to 1 and 1,000,000 to 1 chance that this could have happened just by accident. There were chemical analyses done on Betty's dress. Many chemical analyses, a fairly extensive one done at the University of Cincinnati. They said the pink was strange in relation to the inorganic elemental compound, high inorganic hydrocarbons. In 2000, Pinelandia Biophysics Laboratory did a bioassay seed growth test with water that they had soaked Betty's dress in. The pink part, the blue part, and just plain water. The water that was soaked with the pink part of the dress had plant growth at an extraordinarily high rate, which was highly unusual. Phyllis Budinger did a report, fairly extensive as well, from 2001 to 2003 at the Frontier Analysis Laboratory. She has a master's degree in chemistry, and she worked for BP Amoco, formerly Standard Oil, for 35 years. And it was her job to identify difficult to identify chemicals. So she said the chemical analysis supports Betty's account of the event. The thing that was really interesting, I thought I had a picture of the dress, but I guess I don't. The thing that was really interesting to me was that I spoke with a government scientist, has his doctorate in plant biology. And he said to me, I know what happened to Betty's dress. He said, I believe that it was a fungus or a yeast. I believe that Betty's dress was exposed to something that killed all of the bacteria and viruses on that dress. And then I believe that those non-human entities deposited this substance onto Betty's dress, and it grew and flourished, and then it died. An interesting thing about that is that it was bioluminescent. It fluoresced under a UV light as well. So that is an explanation by a PhD scientist that I find very intriguing, especially because their dog Delcy developed a fungus infection on her back after the event. Betty also saw symbols on the craft. Those were in that tablet that she wanted to take with her. I asked her in the year 2000 to sketch those symbols for me. Her memory was a little rusty. She took a couple of weeks, but I put those symbols into my locked file cabinet, and they were not published until 2007 when my book was released. And Dr. Don C. Donderi saw those symbols in my book. Well, in 2004, he and some other PhD academics had done a symbols study. And what they discovered is that many of the symbols, and this is what he said, the symbols Betty remembered and that were published for the first time in 2007 look remarkably like many of the symbols that Hopkins had been collecting from abductees since 1975. So another piece of scientific information. Betty and Barney faced harassment after that. When they were going up looking for the spot where the craft landed, for this spot where they drove onto a different road or found themselves there, one night they returned home, and on Betty's table were earrings. These are the earrings she was wearing that night. They were in leaves. They hadn't been there in the morning. This was really startling. And those were Betty's earrings. She hadn't realized they were missing, but somehow they were returned. There was also an ice mound that they found on the counter, the breakfast bar in their dining room, in their kitchen. One time, after Barney's death, Betty found a mound of coats taken from her closet and piled in a mound with Barney's scarf laying over the top. Very weird things. Chairs from her dining room moved into her living room and arranged in a circle. She was doing her taxes. She had everything in a bag to take to her accountant, and suddenly they disappeared from her house. A few months later, a couple of months later, they reappeared and they were scattered in a trail throughout her apartment. I was living there with Betty. I was a student at the University of New Hampshire at the time. I had the basement apartment. We always kept the door unlocked between my apartment and hers. And whenever she would come home, I would go up and join her. We had our meals together. And on this particular day, I was downstairs studying, and I heard what I thought was Betty coming into the house. So I went up the stairs to greet her. No Betty. Called for her, no Betty. I thought, well, maybe she just came in and left immediately. And so I went back downstairs to start studying again, and I heard a crash. I heard these loud sounds on the floor as if somebody were running. I went running up the stairs. The front door to her apartment was open. The closet door was open. A baseball bat that belonged to her was laying on the floor. The front door to the apartment house was open. The gate was open, and there was a man in a tan suit running down the road. Betty finally had one of the early versions of a security system installed in her house, and it did go off once, and the police came, but that was the last time that she had difficulty. Her phone was also tapped, and she agreed to take part in Close Encounter of the Fifth Kind experiments. Barney did as well, but it was basically Betty who did this to try to call in a UFO to land. She started by trying to get them to land on my grandparents' farm in Kingston, and I grew up across the street from their farm. And she would go out to her back porch every night, and she would try to send these messages to these non-human entities. And this is what they wrote to her, these scientists, that she was supposed to repeat. Well, in February of 1966, we were out looking for UFOs. Family friend was with us, and I'm getting to vectoring them in very shortly. Family friend was with us, my mother, my grandmother, my brother, and my mother, Betty. And we went down to Country Pond, which was very close to where I grew up, and we saw a UFO. And it appeared to be just above the ice over here. We went down this embankment toward the lake. It was frozen then, went out onto the lake. The craft picked up, lifted up, and traveled over the tops of those trees, and then around, along the trees at the edge of the lake. We got back into the car, and we chased it to see where it went. So most of us were standing on this side of a bridge looking out for the craft. My mother was standing on this side of the bridge, and she saw two craft hovering just above the ice. And one of them put out this funnel-like beam, and it didn't come all at once like a light. It came out toward her in a measured way, and it hit her, and she yelled. And we all went back and to the car and got into the car very, very quickly and went back to my childhood home, my grandparents' home in Kingston. We could never understand why it took us so long. The hours just flew by that night. It was almost 10 o'clock by the time we arrived home. And a UFO landed on my grandparents' farm in April of 1966. It was observed by two people. I have this picture here, not to show you me in a swimsuit, but right back in here is where the UFO landed. It left physical trace evidence on the ground. It was investigated scientifically. And by the way, this is my grandmother, Florence Barrett, my grandfather, Raymond Barrett. This is their house and their garage back here. They had a Dutch colonial house, and then Betty and Barney. To move on to the psychophysics experiments, in 1967, this team of scientists convinced Betty to do an experiment with them. And they all assembled on my grandparents' farm. They were all camped out in tents. Jacques Vallée and his wife were there, the famous astronomer. And so they were out there looking for a UFO. Betty had been given only a week preparation to try to vector in this craft. but they had found that she had success if she was given 4 months to send these messages. So I don't know why they thought she could do this in 1 week's time. She didn't. The UFO did not show up, but a week later, one did show up and came in very, very close, about a mile away from there, and it was observed by 2 astronomers. It's in NICAP's files. Here they are, camping out that night. There's Betty, you can see her, and my mother is right here. Robert Homan, C.D. Jackson. These are some of the photographs of what Betty thought were unconventional flying objects that she took over the years. This is one that is in captured, and it's in black and white. It doesn't show a lot there. But on the original photo, it looked like there was an entity standing in this window. You can see what looks like a neck and shoulders there. In the original film, which didn't show up on this, was what appeared to be a head, but you could not see features. There's another one. And I had personal experiences that began, and my family did as well. They began after that craft landed on my grandparents' farm in April of 1966. So, it was only 500 feet from my childhood home, and all of a sudden, doors started to open and close on their own. That never happened before. Light orbs were seen, sort of moving around the house. We now know, based upon comprehensive studies that I've participated in, most recently with FREE, with 3,100 experiencers, and with MUFON on 516 experiencers, that the majority of experiencers have seen these light orbs in their homes. So I didn't see them at that time. I went off to college, but family members saw them. I was beginning to wonder. I was being very scientific as a college freshman and thought I knew more than my family, and I thought they must be losing it. And I was very, very startled. Years later, when I was back there visiting my mother, I had my 2 young children at that time. I had a son who was 4 and a son who was 2. And so we're sleeping in what had been my brother's bedrooms, and I was in the middle in what had been my childhood bedroom, when all of a sudden my 4-year-old son wakes me up in the middle of the night. He's wreaking havoc, running around the bedroom. And so I get up out of bed. I'm not very happy about getting woken up. I open the door. I'd left the nightlight on for him. And there he is, running around the room, jumping into the air, trying to touch this light orb that's moving around the room. It seemed to be having a lot of fun with him, too. I was so shocked. I immediately scooped him up and took him into my bed, went to sleep immediately, slept late the next morning. I said to him, "What was that all about last night?" And he said, "Oh, that's the guy who comes to see me in the middle of the night." Something else happened in my brother's bedroom, and this is when I was in college as well. He had come home with me for the weekend. It was the summer, and my parents had a cabin cruiser, and we'd take it out fishing on the ocean. And so we were going to get up early in the morning, and he stayed in my brother's bedroom. My brother was in the service then, in the Army. It was during the Vietnam War. And so we're all asleep, and in the middle of the night, he starts screaming, this boyfriend of mine. He runs from the house and he goes outside. What had happened is the coat hangers had lifted out of my brother's closet, had flown across the room and landed on top of him. Was not really good for our relationship, I'll tell you. My mother had to coax him into coming back into the house, and he would not sleep in that bedroom. This right here is a photograph of a light orb, very much like the one that I saw, that my son was playing with. This comes from an experiencer in Canada whose case I've investigated for a very long period of time. He had been diagnosed with cancer. When this light orb he was able to photograph it coming down his wall and flying across his bedroom. It dove down into his body and it cured his cancer. His medical records are with a doctor in California, a medical doctor, and the medical doctor has written about this in Free's new book, Beyond UFOs, The Science of Consciousness and Contact with Non-Human Intelligence. I have a very long chapter in that book as well. Here's a statement that Betty made to Dr. Berthold Schwartz, who was a psychiatrist who lived in New Jersey and then retired into Florida. She said, "These things are happening to Barney and me as well as to my relatives, but they have also been witnessed by other people who were present. We do not believe in ghosts, but we do believe in space travel and life on other planets. So we wonder if these space travelers might have the ability to be unseen by us." Well, certainly, if they are interdimensional, which I believe they are, I believe that they use technology to come into our three-dimensional realm, they would be unseen, or some people are able to see just a shimmering of their outline before they become three-dimensional. And here's Denise Stoner, who was my co-author on the alien abduction files. She grew up in Connecticut and had lifelong experiences. She was a generational contactee. Her mother was also taken. And we did a commonality study way back in 2012 with 75 participants, 50 who were abductees. And the question we asked is, have you witnessed paranormal activity in your home? And if so, what did you observe? Well, 88% answered in the affirmative. In MUFON's new study that I did with Dr. Don Derry, 75% of the 516 people had paranormal activity in their homes, and it was also true of Free's study. So very close statistically. 51% said their paranormal activity began after their first abduction or contact experience. And the two most common types of paranormal activity are those light orbs that appear to be intelligently controlled and feeling that something unseen is walking on the bed. I was very pleased that the state of New Hampshire erected this historical marker to commemorate Betty's and Barney's experience. It sits right out in front of the Indian Head Resort. In the end, these are the 4 books that I have for sale here today, autographed by both Stanton and myself, and Denise and myself, and at a discount of only $15 per book. And my newest book, which is written for experiencers, is going to be released in 2019. I had hoped to have it today, but it hasn't been published yet. So this comes to the end of my time. Thank you so much for coming.